The year is 1954. The sun over San Bernardino, California is a white, unforgiving fire. A man 52 years old steps out of his dusty sedan. His back aches. The suit, the one he's worn for 1,000 pitches, hangs loosely on his frame. He isn't a success. He is a traveling salesman of milkshake mixers, a man whose best years are a fading speck in the rearview mirror. He's here on this hot patch of asphalt, only to see why this one small hamburger stand needs 8 of his machines. He orders a burger. It arrives in seconds, wrapped in paper. He takes a bite. And in that instant, his entire world stops. It's not the taste. It's the system. It's the speed. It's the sight of a kitchen running with the precision of a Swiss watch. It's the sound of an empire. But this light, this epiphany, only came after 30 years of darkness. 30 years of chasing a dream he couldn't even name. 30 years of failure. 30 years of driving endless lonely highways, his trunk full of samples, his heart full of doubt. 30 years of hearing, "No, thank you, Mr. Kroc." 30 years of cold coffee in chipped diner cups, of cheap motel rooms that smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant, of lying awake at 3 a.m., the glow of a flickering no vacancy sign painting the ceiling, wondering, is this all there is? Hello, and welcome to Never Too Late to Shine. Most of the time, we look at a life of success and we see the final polished result. We see the billions. We see the golden arches. But tonight, we are telling a different story. We are exploring the long, unwritten middle. We are sitting with the 52-year-old man in the cheap suit, the one who was written off, the one who was told every single day that his time was over. This is the story of how that man, broke and exhausted, found the courage to start his real life in the decade when most men are finishing theirs. If these quiet reflections on history's giants help you unwind, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps others discover these stories too. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Which person whose late bloom illuminated the world would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below. To understand how Ray Kroc built an empire, we must first understand the man who had nothing left to lose. We must understand the ember that refused to die. Because before he could change the world, he had to survive 50 years of the world trying to break him. Chapter 1. The Restless Salesman. What is it that makes a man keep going? What is that quiet, stubborn, almost irrational spark in the human soul that refuses to accept the world's judgment? When half a lifetime of effort, of sweat, of hope, of driving through the rain has given you little more than blisters and debt and the hollow echo of your own voice in an empty motel room? That was the riddle of Ray Kroc's first 50 years. He was born in 1902, not in a log cabin, but in the respectable, tree-lined suburb of Oak Park, Illinois. It was a place of clipped lawns, white picket fences, and quiet ambition. A place that smelled of cut grass and Midwestern integrity. It was the America that believed in order. He was born to immigrant parents who embodied that order. His father, Alois, was Czech. He was a man who believed in steady work and steady lives. He kept the family afloat with a quiet, unbending discipline. He was the kind of man who sat in the same hard-backed chair every evening, who read the paper from front to back, who believed that life was a ladder to be climbed, one careful, sensible rung at a time. His mother, Rose, held the home together with equal parts care and toughness. Her hands, smelling of lye soap and love, taught him that responsibility was the price of admission to a good life. They were good people. They taught their children to save their pennies, to be practical, to aim for security. Ray wanted leaps. He wanted the trapeze. He was born restless. He was born with a hum inside him, a frequency that didn't match the quiet suburban street he lived on. As a boy, he discovered music, or perhaps it discovered him. The piano became his first stage, and he had it. That intangible thing, that spark, that presence. He had the kind of charisma that could hush a crowded room, that could make people turn their heads and listen. By his teens, he was playing gigs, his fingers dancing on the keys, dreaming of a future under the bright, hot lights of a vaudeville stage. But dreams, as they so often do, crashed hard against reality. The bills didn't wait for the applause to return. The world demanded practicality. At 15, so restless he could barely sit still, so eager to prove himself, he lied about his age. He faked his way into the Red Cross Ambulance Corps to serve in World War I. He saw it as his grand adventure, his escape. He stood in the wool uniform, ready for the call. The war ended before he was ever shipped out. It would become a pattern for his early life. Dressed for the party, but the party was always somewhere else. Then came the years of detours, the wilderness years that stretched into decades. He sold sheet music, his smile wide, his patter fast, convincing people to buy songs they didn't know how to play. He played piano in smoky late-night bars, the kind of places where the laughter was a little too loud and the air was thick with the smell of spilled beer. He wasn't an artist. He was human, background noise. His fingers, which once dreamed of concert halls, now played chopsticks on keys made sticky with whiskey just to earn a tip. He gave lessons to children who would rather be anywhere else. He tried radio. He joined small, forgettable bands, always chasing that big break that never, ever arrived. Each time a small light flickered, it soon dimmed. Each time, Ray would pick up his coat, straighten his tie, and move on. Do you know someone like that? Or perhaps, have you been that person? The one who has tried everything, the one who is talented and charming and full of ideas, but just never finds their fit. That was Ray Kroc. The first real stability, the first rung on that ladder his father spoke of, arrived when he joined the Lily Tulip Cup Company. He sold paper cups, thousands of them, millions of them, and he was good at it. He had the charm. He had the handshake that felt like a promise. He could walk into a hostile room and walk out with an order. He could sell ice in the winter. For a while, it seemed he might settle. This was it. A steady paycheck, a respectable job, a life. But settling wasn't in his bones. The hum was still there. Then one day, he found it. A bulky, gleaming 5-spindled machine called the multi-mixer. To most, it was just a gadget, a heavy piece of stainless steel. To Ray, it was a revolution. He saw it, and his heart raced. In a nation obsessed with diners and soda fountains, a nation falling in love with the automobile, this machine meant speed. It meant 5 milkshakes at once. It meant profit. He threw himself into it. He became the exclusive distributor. He poured every dime he had and dimes he didn't have into this one beautiful machine. He believed it would make him rich. Instead, it kept him on the razor's edge of survival. By his 40s, he was living paycheck to paycheck. By his 50s, he was in debt. His life became a blur of endless grinding travel. Picture him, 52 years old, driving his sedan across the flat gray highways of the Midwest. The trunk isn't full of luggage. It's full of heavy multi-mixer machines he has to lug by himself into diners. His car carries the scent of machine grease, stale coffee from a thermos, and the faint, desperate perfume of a traveling salesman. Have you ever felt that specific, modern loneliness? The loneliness of the highway? The hypnotic thump, thump, thump of the tires on the pavement? The disembodied voice on the radio, fading to static as you drive out of range? The flickering motel signs, each one a false promise of home. This was his life. The chipped coffee cups in roadside diners, the polite, soul-crushing rejections. "Sorry, Ray, things are slow." "We just don't need 'em, Mr. Kroc." He'd tip his hat. He'd keep that salesman's smile plastered on his face, and he'd move on. But at home, the weight was heavier still. Ethel, his wife, wanted a husband. Not a ghost who appeared for a weekend smelling of road dust and gasoline. She wanted a steady partner. She wanted dinners together. She wanted a life without the constant, terrifying risk of the phone being disconnected. She saw a man chasing a fantasy. She saw the unpaid bills. She saw the man she loved, now in his 50s, still acting like a kid with a dream. "Ray, please," we can hear her saying, her voice strained with a weariness that had become permanent. Why can't this be enough? Why can't we be enough? Have you ever stood at that cruel, impossible crossroads? The one between the safe, warm, good life your loved ones ask you to live versus the uncertain, irrational, invisible one your spirit demands? Ray lived at that crossroads every single day. He loved Ethel, but he could not choose her over the hum. He could not choose peace over the promise of the road. And slowly, painfully, their marriage cracked. The arguments deepened into long, bitter silences. The shared bed became a cold, empty space. By the early 1950s, he was 52, broke. His marriage, a hollow shell, still lugging those heavy multi-mixers in his trunk, still knocking on doors, still smiling when his inside sagged with doubt. Most men his age were planning for retirement. They were looking at fishing trips, at time with their grandchildren. Ray Kroc was still chasing something invisible. People called him foolish, a dreamer, a failure. Some pitied him. Others, in the industry, laughed behind his back. Old man Kroc, still thinking he's gonna strike it rich. Sometimes, in those lonely motel rooms, with the peeling wallpaper and the single buzzing fluorescent light in the bathroom, he wondered if they were right. Was he a man chasing smoke? Was this all there was? And here lies the twist. Here is the NTLTS moment. At the very, very moment, his life looked finished. At the precise point where any rational man would have given up, destiny knocked. It wasn't a grand announcement. It was a small, strange order that came into his tiny, failing office. An order. Not for one multi-mixer, not for two. 8. 8 multi-mixers, all for a single tiny drive-in hamburger stand in the middle of nowhere. San Bernardino, California. 8 machines. That meant 40 milkshakes at once. Who on earth? Who could possibly need to make 40 milkshakes at the same time? Ray couldn't believe it. It had to be a mistake. He picked up the phone. The order was real. He hung up. He looked at the map. He had to see it for himself. So he packed his car, pointed it west, and began the long, dusty drive toward the sun. He didn't know it yet. He couldn't have. But he was driving straight into history. Waiting for him were two brothers, Richard and Maurice McDonald, and a restaurant that would not only change his fortune, it would change the way the world eats. Chapter 2. The Golden Arches Appear. Sometimes destiny doesn't announce itself with trumpets and thunder. Sometimes it doesn't arrive as a grand visitor in a fine suit. Sometimes it just sits quietly at the edge of a California highway, under a sun that feels hot enough to crack your lips. Sometimes it's shaped like two simple golden arches. In 1954, Ray Kroc pulled his weary, dust-covered sedan into San Bernardino. This wasn't the gray, damp Midwest he had just left. This was a different world. The sun was a sharp, brilliant fire. The sky was a clear, piercing blue. The air was so dry it felt electric. He was here chasing a simple mystery, a single hamburger stand that needed to make 40 milkshakes at one time. What he found didn't look like a palace. It was a modest, octagonal building, white and red tiles, spotless glass. But flanking it, rising into that clear blue sky, were two golden arches that seemed to stretch toward the heavens. And the energy, it was palpable. The parking lot was full. People weren't sitting in their cars waiting for a car hop. They were lined up, laughing, families, teenagers, workers in trucks, and pulsing through the air, mixing with the laughter, was a smell. That smell, the one that had haunted his highways, the smell of beef sizzling on a hot flat-top grill, the sharp, sweet crackle of onions, the sound of fries bubbling in clean oil, the thick, cold promise of milkshakes. Here, that smell wasn't just a hint on the breeze. It was the main event. Ray got in line, just like everyone else, his salesman's eyes taking in everything. The menu shocked him. It was the absence that was stunning. No chicken dinners, no spaghetti plates, no fish sandwiches, no endless, agonizing list of compromises. Just hamburgers, cheeseburgers, fries, milkshakes, sodas. That was it. He placed his order, a burger and fries. He expected the usual gruff, "Be a few minutes." Seconds later, the food was in his hand, wrapped in paper, hot, ready. He took a bite. It wasn't a gourmet meal. It wasn't fancy, but it was good. It was clean. It was perfectly consistent. It was dependable. It was exactly what it promised to be. And that was the genius. But the food was only half the story. What truly, literally, took his breath away was the system behind the counter. He stood there, mesmerized, watching through the wide-open service window. It wasn't a kitchen. It was a factory. It was a ballet. The workers, all men, dressed in clean white uniforms and paper hats, moved with a silent, hypnotic rhythm. There was no shouting, no chaos, no wasted motion. One man laid the buns in precise rows. Another flipped the patties, perfectly timed. A third applied the condiments, squirt, squirt, 2 pumps of ketchup, a single dash of mustard. A fourth wrapped the finished product, slid it down a chute. Each motion was sharp, efficient, drilled, repeated like a dance rehearsed 1,000 times. The McDonald brothers, Richard and Maurice, called it the speedy service system. To Ray Kroc, it was a revelation. It was the sound of a lock clicking open in his mind. Have you ever felt that? A moment in your life when everything, every failure, every wrong turn, every dead end suddenly clicks into place and makes a perfect, terrifying kind of sense? That was Ray Kroc, standing on that hot asphalt, watching that kitchen run. All the failures, all the miles, all the lonely motel nights, all the doubts, they all suddenly made sense. His entire life had been a study in speed and efficiency. selling paper cups to save a soda fountain 2 seconds, selling a multi-mixer to make 5 shakes instead of 1. He had spent 30 years selling parts of this equation. And here, in the middle of the desert, 2 brothers had built the whole machine. They hadn't just built a better restaurant, they had built a new way. After finishing his meal, Ray introduced himself to the owners, Richard and Morris McDonald. They were plain men, modest, quiet, proud of what they'd built. They were happy to show this fast-talking salesman from Illinois their kitchen. They showed him the custom-built condiment dispensers, the precise layout, the discipline, the simplicity. Ray's heart raced as he listened. His pulse pounded in his ears, louder than the kitchen sounds. He didn't just see San Bernardino. He saw Chicago. He saw New York. He saw Miami. He saw highways stretching from coast to coast, and on every major exit, he saw this. He saw those arches glowing in the dusk like beacons. He imagined children in the back seats of station wagons screaming, "Daddy, pull over! There's one!" He imagined travelers, tired and far from home, finding a small piece of comfort in the familiar. A family, sharing the exact same meal, the exact same taste, in towns thousands of miles apart. That night, in his cheap motel room, he couldn't sleep. He paced the linoleum floor, his mind buzzing, his heart pounding with an energy he hadn't felt in 30 years. He wasn't chasing a burger. He was chasing a revolution, a new American ritual. But here was the twist. The gut-wrenching, terrible twist. The next day, when he proposed his grand vision, the McDonald brothers hesitated. They didn't share his fire. They didn't want an empire. Expansion to them was just a headache. It meant airplanes and quality control and stress. "We're happy with what we have, Mr. Kroc," they said, plain and simple. They were proud of their local success. They wanted to protect what they had. A few more stores maybe, but nothing reckless. That was the difference between them. The brothers saw a restaurant. Ray Kroc saw an empire. Have you ever looked at something ordinary, a small idea, a simple moment, and felt deep in your bones that it was extraordinary? That you were the only one who could see its true, magnificent potential? That was Ray that night. He had spent 52 years searching for a dream he couldn't name. Now he had found it, and it was owned by 2 men who didn't want it. But the road ahead would not be kind. To turn this small, perfect burger stand into a global empire, Ray would need money he didn't have. He would need faith from people who had every reason to doubt him. And he would need a level of grit, of ruthless, single-minded determination that most men his age had long since spent. He would have to risk his health, his home, his marriage, and his reputation. And he would not turn back. Because in San Bernardino, under the bright, hopeful glow of 2 golden arches, Ray Kroc finally found the answer to the question that had haunted him for decades. What do you do when the world says it's too late? You start again, and you start big. Chapter 3. Dreams on Credit and Grit. What do you do when your dream is bigger than your wallet? When the vision that sets your soul on fire is met by the cold, indifferent stare of the world? Most men, especially men in their 50s, scale the dream down. They compromise, they sigh, they file it away under what might have been, and they settle. But Ray Kroc was not most men. After San Bernardino, he was a different person. He was, in a word, possessed. He could see it. He could taste it. He would be driving through the gray drizzle of Illinois. But in his mind, he would see golden arches rising against a clear blue California sky. He could hear the sizzle of the grill, the chime of the cash register. He saw a nation of families on the move, united by a single dependable 15-cent meal. To Ray, it wasn't just food. It was trust. It was comfort. It was the new American identity. The McDonald brothers, back in their quiet California town, did not share his fire. They were good men, proud men, but they were restaurateurs, not revolutionaries. They valued control and simplicity. "We're happy with what we have, Ray," they told him over the phone, their voices calm and rational against his frantic evangelical pitching. But Ray leaned forward, even though he was alone in his small office, painting pictures of a nation united by those arches. He wasn't just selling them. He was willing it into existence. He promised to take all the risk himself. He would honor their system, their name, their quality. Finally, reluctantly, exhausted by his sheer relentless energy, they agreed. He could franchise their system. The contract was drawn. Their reward was small, a fraction of a percent of sales. But to Ray, it was priceless. It wasn't money. It was permission. It was the key to the car. It gave him permission to chase the impossible. In 1955, in Des Plaines, Illinois, Ray Kroc, at 52 years old, opened his first franchise McDonald's. It was a cathedral of speed. The red and white tiles shone like porcelain. The stainless steel, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, was polished to a mirror finish. And those two golden arches, beaming against the Midwestern sky, were a declaration of war against the old way of eating. Crowds poured in. Children, their faces pressed against the glass, clutched their hot paper bags of fries. Parents marveled at the speed, the cleanliness. Teenagers laughed over thick 16-ounce milkshakes. Ray was there, not in an office. He was there, on the floor in his suit. He'd be wiping down a counter one minute, checking the temperature of the fryers the next, his sharp, restless eyes everywhere. He watched tray after tray slide across the counter, and he thought, "This will work. This must work." But behind the smiles and the sizzling grill, his reality was grim. The vision was golden. His bank account was empty. The banks just laughed. Can you picture it? A 52-year-old man with a history of failed ventures walking into a silent, marble-floored bank, trying to explain his grand vision. "It's the future," he'd say, his voice full of that salesman's fire. "It's not a restaurant. It's America." And the banker, a man in a gray suit, would look at him over his spectacles, smile politely and say, "Mr. Kroc, it's a hamburger stand." He was turned away, again and again and again. Investors? They laughed even harder. A 52-year-old chasing burgers? It was a joke. So Ray did the one thing he had left to do. He went all in. He mortgaged his home. He signed his name on personal notes to the bank, borrowing against a future he could see, but no one else could. He lived on credit and pure, uncut grit. The physical price was immediate. At night, he'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his chest tight with a pain he mistook for anxiety. His arthritis, fueled by the stress, gnawed at his joints. His diabetes, which he mostly ignored, stalked him. But every morning, he would get up, wince as he stood, and knot his tie. He'd put the smile back on and drive to pitch his dream again. At home, however, the price was heavier. This wasn't a business plan to Ethel, his wife. It was a betrayal. It was the final, reckless act of a man she no longer understood. She wanted peace. She was tired. She had endured 30 years of his schemes, of his absences, of his next big thing. She wanted evenings together. She wanted security. She wanted a husband who was present. "Why, Ray?" she would plead, her voice worn thin, not with anger, but with a deep, bottomless exhaustion. "Why can't you be satisfied? The house is mortgaged. You're sick. You're 52 years old. Why can't you just stop?" But his hunger wasn't for money alone. It was for meaning. It was for proof. Proof that his entire restless, grinding life hadn't been a mistake. Proof that he wasn't just an ordinary failed salesman. Their marriage, already cracked, now crumbled under the strain. The absences grew longer. The arguments, sharp and painful, eventually faded into the cold, heavy silence of two people living in the same house, but in different worlds. Ray loved Ethel, but he could not, would not choose her over the Arches. Have you ever faced that cruel, impossible choice? The one between the love of your life and the life of your dreams? The one between the person you are and the person you know you were born to be? Ray faced it, and he chose the dream. Meanwhile, franchising was war. He had to recruit franchisees, other men willing to gamble their life savings on his vision. He had to win their trust, and then he had to hold them to his merciless, almost fanatical standards. Because Ray understood something deeper than food. People didn't just want a cheap meal. They wanted certainty. In a chaotic, fast-moving, post-war world, they craved comfort. They wanted to know that no matter where they traveled, no matter what highway they were on, the hamburger in their hand would taste exactly the same. The fries would be hot. The milkshake would be thick. The restrooms would be spotless. That promise, that absolute, unwavering comfort of sameness, that was McDonald's true power. He enforced it with an iron hand. Every burger had to weigh exactly 1.6 ounces. Every patty exactly 10% fat. Fries cut to precisely 9/32 of an inch, fried for precisely 3 minutes. He would drop in on stores unannounced, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He'd run a finger along a countertop looking for grease. He'd inspect the trash cans. If a store slipped, if the fries were soggy or the floor was dirty, Ray's anger was swift and legendary. Some called him obsessive. Some called him impossible. But customers called it reliable. And that was all he cared about. By the late 1950s, it was working. Franchises spread across the Midwest. Those arches began to glow town after town. Crowds lined up. Sales soared. For the first time in his life, Ray Kroc, now approaching 60, tasted momentum. But success brought a new, terrible tension. The McDonald brothers back in California grew nervous. Ray's push was faster, bolder, louder than they ever imagined. They feared their masterpiece was slipping from their control. They resisted his changes. They tightened their grip. They pushed back. And here lies the final agonizing twist of his struggle. Ray realized with a cold, dawning horror that as long as the brothers held the name, his dream was in chains. He was the one risking everything. His home, his health, his marriage. He was the one pouring his very lifeblood into building this empire, and they were just collecting a check. He had sacrificed his entire world for this vision. Would he let their caution, their small-town thinking, cage his ambition now? He decided, deep inside, in that quiet, restless 3 a.m. part of his soul, that he would not. Chapter 4. Battles of Vision and Ownership. Every dream, no matter how golden, no matter how pure, eventually casts a shadow. For Ray Kroc, The man who saw a new America in the reflection of a 15-cent hamburger, that shadow was cast by two men. The very men whose idea he had sworn to honor. The very men whose name was on the sign. Richard and Morris McDonald. At first, the partnership, separated by 2,000 miles of highway, seemed simple. The brothers, back of the quiet sun of San Bernardino, had the system, the speedy service ballet. Ray, in the cold driving rain of Chicago, had the fire. Together, they could spread this new gospel of fast food across the nation. But as the arches multiplied, like a reflection in a broken mirror, the cracks grew deeper. The McDonalds were meticulous men. They were craftsmen. Their San Bernardino store was their masterpiece, a perfect kitchen that ran with the quiet precision of a laboratory. Expansion to them meant danger. It meant a loss of control. Too many stores, too far away, could mean sloppy fries, soggy burgers, dirty counters. Quality above all, Ray, they would insist, their voices calm and firm over the long-distance telephone line. We will not sacrifice the name. Ray agreed, on the surface. Of course, boys, of course. Quality is our watchword. But in his heart, his ambition burned hotter. His vision was different. He didn't just want a chain of high-quality restaurants. He wanted a revolution. He wanted arches in every town, glowing as familiar as church steeples. He wanted McDonald's to be as American as the flag itself. He wasn't just building a business, he was building an identity. The disagreements began small, but they were never about the small things. They argued over powdered milkshakes. Ray saw them as a brilliant feat of engineering, a way to guarantee consistency, speed, and profit, eliminating the need for freezers. The brothers were horrified. It was a betrayal of the thick, creamy, real milkshakes they were famous for. They argued over menu changes. They argued over store design. They argued over franchisee freedom versus Ray's iron-fisted control. Each clash, each letter, each tense phone call left a residue of resentment. And behind his salesman's smile, Ray Kroc felt chained. He was the one on the road, pounding the pavement, his back aching. He was the one convincing bankers to lend, the one recruiting investors, the one enforcing those perfect standards in a dozen different states. He was the one pouring his last ounce of health into this gamble. And yet, final power, the final yes or no, still rested with two cautious brothers in California who were just collecting their royalty. At home, the strain had consumed his life. His marriage to Ethel was gone, a casualty of the road, a casualty of the dream. A brief, hopeful second marriage had also failed, collapsing under the weight of his obsession. The arches were his true spouse. Now, every ounce of energy, every waking thought, every beat of his strained heart belonged to them. Have you ever watched a partnership collapse, not from failure, but from success? That was Ray and the McDonald brothers. Together, they had struck gold, but they could not, would not agree on how to shape it. The brothers, in Ray's eyes, were trying to keep an ocean in a teacup. And in the brothers' eyes, Ray was a man willing to flood the whole world to prove a point. And so Ray, now approaching 60, made his choice. He had to. He would own McDonald's, outright. In 1961, he flew to California. He sat across from them. The man who had once begged them for a chance now sat as their conqueror. He offered them $2.7 million. It was an astronomical sum at the time, enough for each brother to walk away with $1 million after taxes, a fortune. Exhausted by the constant battles, by this restless, relentless Chicago salesman who never seemed to sleep, the brothers agreed. The contracts were signed. The lawyers shook hands. McDonald's, the name, the system, the arches, the future, now belonged entirely, solely to Ray Kroc. But there was a bitter footnote, a final, quiet, devastating detail. According to legend, as the deal was closing, the brothers asked for one last promise, a handshake agreement, a 0.5% royalty on all future sales, a gentleman's agreement, they called it. Ray, exuberant, victorious, shook their hands. Of course, boys, of course. Yet when the papers were finalized, when the ink was dry, that royalty clause was gone. That 0.5%, a handshake that would be worth billions today, never reached them. Was it a deliberate betrayal? A shrewd, ruthless business move? Or was it, as Ray's side would later claim, a misunderstanding, a detail lost in the shuffle, a fiction invented by the brothers after the fact? History is written by the winners, and historians still debate. Some call Ray ruthless, a thief who stole the golden arches. Others call him a pragmatic visionary, the only man who truly understood what he was holding. Either way, the result was the same. The McDonald brothers faded, quietly, bitterly, into obscurity, living out their lives in the shadow of their own name. And Ray Kroc became the undisputed face of the empire. Here lies the twist. The moment of his greatest triumph was also the moment of his greatest moral compromise. McDonald's was no longer a partnership. It was Ray's dream, alone. His rules, his vision, his name on every single decision. He had won the battle. He had secured the crown. But that victory, that crown, would always carry the faint, bitter taste of that broken handshake. The whispers of ruthlessness would follow him for the rest of his life. He had proven himself unstoppable, but he had also proven himself unyielding. Have you ever wondered if success can still feel sweet, if it can still feel whole when it comes salted with betrayal? That was the question that would follow Ray, even as he built an empire that would dwarf the imagination. Yet he didn't slow down. He couldn't. The battle was over. The arches were his. And nothing, not doubt, not critics, not the ghosts of two brothers, and not his own conscience would stop him now. Chapter 5. From burgers to empire. The battles were over. The chains were broken. The name on the contract was his. Now, Ray Kroc, at 60 years old, could finally unleash the vision that had been burning inside him since that first bite in San Bernardino. And unleash it he did. It was no longer a negotiation. It was an invasion. By the 1960s, America was moving faster than it ever had before. It was a nation in love with the automobile. Highways, black and endless, carved across the land, stitching suburbs to cities, coast to coast. Families, piling into new gleaming station wagons, became modern-day pioneers. And as they drove, kids pressing their faces against the glass, looking out at an unfamiliar landscape, they began to search, not for adventure, but for comfort. McDonald's. McDonald's became that sign. That was Ray's genius. He wasn't selling a hamburger. He was selling a promise. His promise was simple, and in its simplicity, it was revolutionary. No matter where you are, no matter what town you've just driven into, a hamburger in Illinois will taste exactly like a hamburger in California. The fries in Florida will crunch with the exact same crispness as the fries in New York. Bright counters, spotless restrooms, and those golden arches glowing with a familiar, unwavering welcome. It wasn't just food. It was trust. And in a world that was spinning faster and faster, a world of new anxieties and Cold War fears, trust was priceless. He enforced this promise with an iron hand, a fanatical, almost terrifying devotion to sameness. His operations manuals became his Bible. Burgers weighed exactly 1.6 ounces. Patties were exactly 3.875 inches wide. Onions were sliced at exactly 1/4 inch. Fries, 9/32 of an inch, were fried for precisely 3 minutes. He was a general, and this was his army. He would drop in on stores unannounced, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He'd run a finger along the stainless steel countertops, checking for grease. He'd inspect the mop buckets. He'd time the fry cooks with a stopwatch. He'd taste the pickles. If a store slipped, if a franchisee got lazy, Ray's anger was swift and legendary. Some franchisees bristled. They called him obsessive. They called him impossible. But Ray knew one simple, brutal truth. One sloppy store, one cold hamburger, one dirty restroom could tarnish the promise of them all. Perfection wasn't vanity, it was survival, and it worked. By the mid-1960s, McDonald's was no longer a small chain. It was a phenomenon. Hundreds of locations. The golden arches became as common as church steeples, a new kind of American landmark, glowing across highways like modern beacons. Families planned their road trips around them. Teenagers, flush with pocket money, made them their new hangouts. Travelers, weary and far from home, found a moment of reliable comfort in their familiar hum. McDonald's was no longer just a restaurant. It was America itself, wrapped in paper and served in 2 minutes. And Ray didn't stop at America. Soon, the arches rose in Canada. Then they crossed the ocean, Europe, Asia, the world. It was a strange, almost absurd sight. Those bright, quintessentially American arches rising against the ancient cobblestones of a German city or the bustling foreign streets of Tokyo. For the first time in history, a restaurant wasn't just a local flavor. It was a global identity. To eat at McDonald's in some small town in France was to taste a piece of the American dream. Ray also understood the power of myth. He gave the world Ronald McDonald, a cheerful, Technicolor clown who became, for a generation of children, one of the most recognized figures on earth. Commercials sang jingles that children couldn't forget. "You deserve a break today." McDonald's became woven into the very fabric of childhood, family, and modern culture. It was the reward for a good report card, the easy dinner after a long day, the first job for a million teenagers. By the 1970s, it was more than a company. It was a force, a global empire. But here came the final tragic twist. While the McDonald's empire grew fat and strong with success, Ray Kroc's body grew thin with wear. The machine was breaking down. He had spent decades driving himself like a locomotive, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and pure, uncut ambition. And the bill was coming due. Diabetes, which he had ignored for years, stalked him. Arthritis, a cruel fire in his joints, gnawed at him, making every step a small agony. His gallbladder and thyroid were gone, sacrificed to the stress. His heart, which had pounded with so much vision, now pounded unevenly, painfully. He could no longer fly to every store. He could no longer stand behind the grill. Still, he refused to slow. He attended meetings from hospital beds. He barked orders over the phone, his voice weak, but his will still made of iron. He obsessed over details, over quarterly reports, over the thickness of a pickle. Letting go was unthinkable. McDonald's was no longer just his creation. It was his identity. At home, peace was elusive. His first marriage was a distant, bitter memory. His second, a brief and painful failure. Finally, in his third wife, Joan, he found a lasting partner, a woman who could match his intensity, who understood the fire that drove him, and perhaps a woman who saw the fortune he was building not just as an empire, but as a tool for charity, for good, a conscience he had never had time to develop himself. But even then, his greatest, truest devotion remained the arches. Have you ever known someone who poured so much of themselves into their work, into their one thing, that nothing else could quite reach them? That was Ray. He wasn't just running McDonald's. He was McDonald's. And as the empire grew, the critics sharpened their knives. Some called him ruthless, a thief, the man who had stolen the name from the brothers who invented it. Others accused McDonald's of cheapening the world's culture, of spreading a bland, uniform sameness across the globe, of feeding grease and sugar to a generation, replacing the mom-and-pop diner with a cold, efficient factory. Was Ray feeding the world or poisoning it? Ray, in his 70s, brushed it all off. He had heard no too many times in his life to care about critics now. He had been laughed at by bankers, pitied by friends, screamed at by his wife. The world had told him he was a failure, and he had proven them all wrong. All that mattered was the vision he had carried alone since that hot afternoon in San Bernardino. Arches glowing everywhere, a promise kept to every single customer, and in his quiet moments, perhaps he allowed himself a small, thin smile. Everyone had said he was too old, too late, too tired, too broke. Yet here he stood, in his 60s and 70s, a billionaire, the architect of an empire unmatched in human history. But as every empire builder learns, as they stand atop the mountain they built, success never, ever erases the question of cost. His body was failing. His marriages were broken. The ghosts of the McDonald brothers still stood in the shadows of those glowing arches. Have you ever achieved something great? Something you sacrificed everything for, only to wonder, in the quiet of the night, was it worth the price? That was Ray Kroc in his later years, triumphant and haunted. A man who had outrun failure, but could not outrun time. Chapter 6. The Last Bite of the American Dream. Every story, no matter how triumphant, no matter how loud, eventually slows into a final quiet reflection. For Ray Kroc, the man who moved at the speed of a locomotive, the man who turned hamburgers into a global empire, the final years were filled with both shattering glory and the haunting, inescapable questions of a life lived at full throttle. By the late 1970s, McDonald's was no longer just a restaurant. It was a planet. More than 7,500 locations in over 30 countries. Those golden arches, once a quirky California dream, now glowed on ancient European cobblestones and busy Asian intersections. Ronald McDonald smiled from television screens into millions of living rooms, a figure more recognized by children than the president. For an entire generation, McDonald's wasn't simply food. It was a core part of childhood itself. Ray Kroc had done the unthinkable. The boy from Oak Park, the restless piano player, the failed paper cup salesman, the 52-year-old man lugging milkshake mixers across dusty highways, that man was now a billionaire, a titan, a symbol of raw, unyielding American ambition. And yet, when the applause faded and the shareholder meetings ended and the lights of the office dimmed, he was left with himself, an old man in a body that was failing, with a soul that was still, perhaps, restless. Diabetes, the quiet shadow he had ignored for decades, now shadowed him constantly. Arthritis, a cruel fire, twisted his joints. His gallbladder and thyroid were long gone, casualties of a life lived without quarter. His heart, which had pounded with so much vision, now pounded unevenly, a flawed drum. He could no longer drive the empire at full speed. But even from hospital beds, tubes in his arms, he demanded updates. He barked orders into the phone. He obsessed over the details. Letting go was unthinkable. How could he? McDonald's wasn't just his work. It wasn't just his company. It was his identity. Have you ever known someone who gave so much of themselves to a single dream that in the end, there was nothing left over? That was Ray Kroc in his twilight. The critics circled, louder now. Some called him ruthless, the man who had built an empire on a handshake he'd broken. The man who had pushed aside the two brothers whose names still hung on his arches. Others accused McDonald's of cheapening culture, of replacing the unique local diner with a bland, uniform sameness, of spreading grease and sugar across the globe. Was Ray a hero of enterprise or a villain of greed? Perhaps he was both. And yet, in his marriage to Joan, his third wife, Ray found something softer. Joan was elegant, strong, and deeply compassionate. She was one of the few people who could match his intensity, but she also possessed a conscience he'd never had time to cultivate. She saw the fortune he had built not just as a monument to him, but as a tool. Together, they began to give it away. Millions to hospitals, to addiction research, to charities, to the arts. After Ray's death, Joan would give even more, billions, ensuring that the fortune built on fast food would serve causes far beyond business. Through her, perhaps, Ray glimpsed another kind of empire, one built not of arches, but of compassion. Still, the question lingered. Alone at night, in the quiet, sterile room with his body weakening, did he wonder if it was worth the price? The lost marriages, the bitter forgotten brothers, the friendships sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Did he ever whisper to himself in that 3 a.m. darkness that success had taken more than it gave? History doesn't answer questions like these. It only records the outcome. On January 14, 1984, Ray Kroc died in San Diego at the age of 81. At that exact moment, McDonald's was serving millions of people in nearly every time zone on Earth. Today, that number has multiplied into the billions. His empire outlived him. It outgrew him. It became a permanent, immovable part of daily life around the world. But Ray Kroc's legacy is more than the burgers sold or the arches built. His true legacy, the quiet legacy, is something deeper. It is a raw, imperfect, and powerful reminder that age is not a stop sign, that 52 is not too late, that a lifetime of failures, a trunk full of milkshake mixers, and a wallet full of debt does not erase the possibility of one final, world-changing success. His life was messy. It was imperfect. It was, at times, ruthless. But it was also proof. Proof of a truth that too many of us forget. Greatness does not belong only to the young. It does not belong to the lucky. It belongs to the stubborn, to the restless, to the persistent. It belongs to the ones who, against all reason, refuse to give up. So if you have ever thought your chance is past, if you have ever looked in the mirror and believed the whisper that says, "It's too late," remember Ray Kroc, the weary 52-year-old salesman who found his destiny when the entire world had already written him off. Because the last, most important bite of the American dream is this: it is never too late to shine.